The last lesson is written by Alphonse Daudet. He was a French novelist and short story writer. The last lesson is set in the days of the Franco-Prussian War 1870 to 1871, in which France was defeated by Prussia led by Bismarck. Prussia then consisted of what now are the nations of Germany, Poland and Austria. In this story, the French districts of Alsace and Lorraine have passed into Prussian hands. The narrator of the story is a young school-going boy named Franz. That morning, he was scared as he was late for school. Also, as their teacher M. Hamel had announced the previous day that he would test them on the topic of participles, and Franz did not know anything at all. He was more scared of being scolded. Franz had another option in his mind: to miss school and enjoy the day out in the warm and bright weather. He describes the scene. There were birds chirping on the trees, and the noise of the Prussian soldiers doing the drill behind the sawmill could also be heard. The scene outside was more attractive than the school, but Franz controlled the temptation and chose to attend school. As Franz walked past the town hall, he noticed a huge crowd at the notice board. The war with Prussia had begun 2.5 years ago, and since then all the bad news like losing the war, occupation of Alsace and Lorraine by the enemy, that is Prussia, etc., had been communicated to the people through this bulletin board. Franz kept on walking towards the school and thought in his mind that what news could have been put up at the board now. As he walked hurriedly towards the school, the blacksmith, who was also reading the news and had come along with his trainee, called out to Franz from behind and said that he need not go in such a hurry, as there was plenty of time for him to reach school. Franz thought that the blacksmith was making fun of him, as he was already late for school. When Franz reached the garden outside the school, he was out of breath as he had walked very fast. Franz describes the usual scene at the school in the mornings. A lot of noise created by the moving of desks, children repeating their lessons, and teachers striking the tables with the rulers could be heard. That day was unusual, as there was no such sound coming out of the school, and it seemed that the school was closed as it used to be on a Sunday. Franz had planned that he would take cover under the commotion and reach the class without being noticed, but that did not seem possible. Franz peeped inside his class and saw his classmates seated. Franz was ashamed of being late and feared a scolding, as he had to enter the classroom in front of everyone. Franz found it strange as M. Hamel did not say anything, and on the contrary, politely asked him to get to his seat as the class was about to begin without him. Franz hurried to his seat. After some time, when he overcame the scare and became comfortable, he noticed that their teacher had worn his best embroidered that day. The teacher normally wore it on occasions like inspection and prize distribution days. Franz felt that the atmosphere in the school was unusual and serious. To add to it, the last benches of the classroom were occupied by the senior villageman, Hauser, who was wearing his three-cornered hat, the retired mayor, postmaster, etc. They all looked sad. Hauser had brought his reader, which was old and torn. He had opened it, kept it on his knees, and had placed his spectacles on it. Franz was confused and could not figure out what was happening that day. Just then, M. Hamel told them that it was their last lesson in French, as the Prussians in Berlin had ordered that French language would no longer be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine, and that German language be taught instead. The German teacher would arrive the next day and as this was the last lesson in French, he wanted them to pay attention. Franz was shocked to know that he could not learn French any longer, and now he knew the latest news that had been put up at the bulletin board of the town hall. Franz regretted for not being serious towards his studies and for wasting his time in hunting birds' eggs and playing in the Saar River. Till now, Franz considered his books to be an unwanted burden, but suddenly he starts considering them to be his best friends whom he could never leave. The writer wants to show the change in Franz's attitude towards study after hearing the news that he could not learn French any longer. The news that their teacher M. Hamel was leaving also had a similar impact on him. Franz did not want him to go away. He no longer thought the teacher to be short-tempered and strict. Now Franz knew that M. Hamel was wearing his best dress in honor of his last lesson. He also realized that the village men had come to pay respect and thank M. Hamel for his service of 40 years in that school. The village men had come to the class as they were also repenting for not have studied well in their childhood. They had come to thank their teacher for his 40 years of service as a teacher of French. Also, they wanted to show respect to their country and were sad as their mother tongue French would no longer be taught to them. The teacher calls out to Franz as it is his turn to recite the topic of participles. As the news had impacted Franz, he was eager to study, and so he was desperate to show his eagerness. He wanted to be able to recite the topic in one go and without any mistake and please his teacher. His desperation is reflected in his willingness to give away all that he had in return for reciting the lesson well. As Franz did not know the lesson, he got confused and stood quietly. His heart was beating fast as he was ashamed of himself and did not have the courage to face his teacher. M. Hamel said to Franz that he would not scold him as now he had realized his mistake. Every day Franz told himself that he would study the next day, and now the opportunity to study had ended and he knew nothing. M. Hamel says that all the people of Alsace were to be blamed as no one was serious towards learning. He tells the class that the enemies would laugh at them and say that they only show to be Frenchmen as they can neither speak nor write their own language. He says that Franz should not feel guilty as everyone is at fault. M. Hamel says that Franz's parents were not interested in getting him educated. They wanted him to work out at a farm or a mill and earn some money. He says that as a teacher, he was also not interested in teaching them. He would send them to his home to water the plants. Sometimes he would declare a holiday and go for fishing. M. Hamel then praises their mother tongue, French language, as being the most beautiful, clearest, and most logical language in the world. He tells the class to guard their language, as it is the only way to free oneself from the prison of slavery. If a person knows his mother tongue well, no one can enslave him. Knowing the mother tongue well as a language is a... The teacher took a lesson in grammar. That day Franz was surprised that he understood the lesson with ease. He felt that he had been attentive and that M. Hamel also explained the lesson with a lot of patience. Franz felt that the teacher wanted to give them all the knowledge he had before leaving. After grammar, they had a lesson in writing. M. Hamel gave the class new notebooks with France Alsace beautifully written on them. Franz felt that here was an air of patriotism in the class. The notebooks were like flags of France that were floating all around. The entire class was busy writing, and the only sound that could be heard was that of the pen writing on the paper. Once some mosquitoes flew into the class, but no one panicked, as everyone was busy writing. The writer considers the pigeons sitting on the roof of the class to be students as well, and says that even the pigeons were busy scratching the roof with their claws, and it seemed that they were also busy writing the task of French language. The coo sound of the pigeons could be heard in the class, and Franz wondered that would the Prussians force the pigeons also to change their language and coo in German? The writer wants to say that in between writing, Franz looked at M. Hamel, who sat still and stared at the different things in the classroom in succession, as if he wanted to memorize the appearance of everything before leaving. M. Hamel had been teaching at that same place for the last 40 years. The only changes were that the desk in the classroom had worn out due to use over the years, the walnut trees in the garden outside had grown taller, the hop vine on the outer wall of the school building had climbed up to the roof. Franz feels that the teacher must be heartbroken to be sent away from a place where he had spent 40 years of his life. The noises of his sister packing and moving their luggage could be heard from the room upstairs as they had to leave the next day. M. Hamel remained composed and heard the lesson from the entire class. After the writing task, there was a lesson of history, followed by phonetics, where they recited the sounds of alphabets. Franz referred to the class as babies because although they were grown up, they were reciting the lesson of phonetics, which is usually done by younger children. So he calls himself and his class to be babies. Hauser had put on his spectacles and holding the primer in both his hands, recited the letters with the class. He was crying, his voice trembled as he spoke. Franz had mixed feelings. He found it funny to see how an old man like Hauser was crying and trembling, and on the other hand, he also felt emotional like Hauser did. Franz could never forget this last lesson. Just then, the clock at the church struck 12 and the prayer song began. At the same moment, the sound of the trumpets played by the Prussian soldiers who were returning from the drill was heard. M. Hamel's face became dull and colorless as the time had come for the class to get over. He stood straight and motionless, and Franz says that he had never appeared to be so tall. M. Hamel began to speak but could not continue as he was overpowered by his emotions. He took a piece of chalk and wrote the words Vive la France, meaning Long live France, on the blackboard as large as he could. Then he stopped writing, bent towards the wall, and without speaking anything, signaled the class to leave as the class was over. For short and long questions of this chapter, please see the link given in the description box.